All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is David Krahe. I'm from Russell Reynolds Associates. I'm thrilled to dive into our panel discussion today on a topic that is both complex and critically important for the success of any company, which is CEO transitions. We have an incredibly esteemed lineup of panelists. I'm going to introduce them here in a second. I'm also going to ask our audience if we could get the LSI presentation up, the one on this HDMI. We're going to ask for your input on where we start today. So today's discussion is really around the when, why, and how of making these incredibly complex and critically important changes at the top. So I will do my best to introduce an incredibly esteemed lineup of panelists. So I'm joined today on my left by Mika Nishimura. Mika is a operational partner at Gilde Healthcare, a life sciences focused venture fund with $2 billion in assets under management. She is a seasoned commercialization and board leader, leveraging her expertise to guide medtech ventures through critical growth phases. She's launched disruptive medical technologies in over 50 markets worldwide, ranging from cardiovascular to oncology, and has also played a very pivotal role in scaling early stage organizations, most notably with the $275 million acquisition of Envision Medical by Boston Scientific. Mika sits on the board of SI Bone, as well as Accuray, NEC, and Hoya. Mika, thank you for being here today.
Pleasure.
Thank you. I'm also joined on my far left by Stuart Simpson. So Stuart is currently the CEO of Think Surgical. Stuart's at the forefront of disrupting and expanding access to robotic surgery, bringing a very important cutting-edge technology to a broader patient base. In his former life, he was with Stryker for over 20 years, where he played a really key role in growing that organization from a $3.5 billion competitor to what was in excess of $80 billion juggernaut by the time he departed. He also led the acquisition of Mako Surgical, a $1.75 billion robotics play into Stryker. So, Stuart, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And then my final panelist, Paul LaViolette, in the middle. Paul is the CEO of Pulse Biosciences. He's also the managing partner for SV Health Investors. For those of you that aren't familiar with Pulse, it's actually a NASDAQ-listed pulse frequency ablation. Did I get that right, Paul?
Close.
He'll tell me what I got wrong later. And then SV has been around for several decades with quite a successful track record, over 75 exits through either IPO or M&A. Paul previously served as the COO of Boston Scientific, where he helped scale the company and increase revenue over 20-fold during the 15 years he was at the helm, leading in excess of 24 acquisitions, expanding the global presence of that organization. Paul's been a director of over 25 medtech companies. So I have that right, Paul? Mm-hmm. 7 public, and been chairman 10 times. So he currently sits on the board of Edward Life Sciences and brings a deep investor as well as operational lens to our discussion today. So I have droned on long enough. I don't know if we have the Mentimeter up anymore. Computer's locked. The benefit of technology. So we'll unlock it briefly, and then
most times.
Can you guys see that? Yeah. All right. So if you could scan the QR code, and if you can't get to the QR code, there is a website on the next slide, menti.com. You can enter the code. We want to get your input on what's most interesting to cover first. So the when, the why, and the how of executing these leadership transitions. So Stuart, I'm going to pick on you first. We're going to test your crystal ball skills.
All right.
Where do you think the audience is going to drive us?
So I would go for a spread bet. I think the when and why. So the big questions are the most important topics in my mind. If you force me to pick one of them, I'd say when.
Okay. So it looks like we have a riveting race between the how, which is executing the successful transition. We have two people coming in for the how and one person. All right. So real time. So Mika, I'll put you in conflict with Stuart here for a second.
Because I would have actually said why.
Okay.
Maybe the first one to come, knowing the audience a little bit, like, okay, you're a founder CEO. Why, should my board think about potentially making a change?
Yeah.
CEO.
And I think the why is an interesting one in the sense of the tension between what we call the continuity at the top. So balancing that tension between leadership continuity and change. So why don't we start with what looks like the when on the far left? Okay. So Stuart, your spread bet worked. So we'll go ahead and stop the live Menti. Thank you for your input. So Mika, you picked why. Mm-hmm. Stuart, you picked when. So we'll start with you, Stuart. So on the when you think about the decision to make a change, what are those subtle signs that a company needs a new CEO for that next phase of development or growth?
So I think it's a very, very good question. And my board experience is nowhere near the experience of the other two panelists. But in my experience, I don't think this is a question that is addressed often enough or deeply enough in board conversations. And I think there are several things. Obviously, there are telltale signs. If you, as a company, are missing your deliverables, if things just seem to slip and then be explained away, if things that you predict don't actually materialize, there's all those sort of telltale signs. But also in an early stage company, you're iterating quickly and you're learning quickly, and it's all part of the process. So it's hard for those signals to emerge up through the organization. But I think that's one is when there are telltale signs. The other important telltale sign for me is around culture. And I don't think as a board member, I've ever spent enough time digging into understanding the culture of the CEO, culture of the leadership team, and the deeper culture within the organization, and whether the culture is a fit for the phase of company that you happen to be at. Mm-hmm. And I would say the last point I would make is understanding and being intellectually honest about where are you? Are you in discovery? Are you in product development? Are you in early commercialization? Are you in a scaling phase? Or are you trying to take over the world? Mm-hmm. It's very important to know where those actual transition points are. And it's hard to identify them largely, but to know where those transition points are, because that is a perfect time to say, do we have the right leader and team for the next phase?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be my when.
Yeah. And when you think about what you mentioned, the subtle signs of, is the culture right? Paul, you've seen this at large corporations, you've seen this at early stage corporations. How do you think about, kind of really getting the smoke signals from what's going on in the organization and identifying, is the culture putting the organization on the right path?
Well, A, it's a great point, and I agree with it completely. B, it is hard, right? When you're in a governance role, you're not walking the halls of the business every day. You're seeing the business through the eyes often, not exclusively of the CEO, but of the CEO and the senior management team. There's a degree of insulation there that separates you from what's really going on. And you think about a smaller company that's got a site and 50 or 100 people. Think about a larger company that's got 20 sites. You're very limited in your ability to assess what's the feel of the culture, what's the feel of the organization, is it healthy, is it heading in the right direction, in addition to all of the other performance metrics. So I do think you have to deduce it in some ways from, hey, I always like to think, if you have a person and you see that person this way, but you think, well, maybe they treat other people that way, or maybe they're perceived differently by the team than by the board. What you realize over time is actually no. What you see is what other people see. Mm-hmm. And so if you think there are issues with fundamental things, listening, humility, sensitivity about the business, responsiveness, whatever you may think that could relate to culture and might not yet show up in lagging performance, those are signs that you should assume other people see. They're probably more accentuated in the real world of that facility and those facilities than you see in the boardroom. So I actually think the board members should really be thinking, hey, if we think it's an early warning sign, don't be dismissive. Assume that it's actually more accentuated in the day-to-day operations of a company than what you're actually being shown. Mm-hmm. And there are people, right? There's a senior vice president of human resources or of human capital. There are turnover metrics or other things. Does your company do a culture kind of survey? Mm-hmm. How are we doing on that? How is that trending? There are measurable things, but in the end, assume that I would say be a little bit more pessimistic than optimistic, because you are insulated and you could be misled.
Yeah, that's a really good point on the, kind of going through the organization through the head of HR. But Mika, as you think about communicating these underperformance issues, these subtle signs, what do you find most effective in terms of moving from identification to addressing it, and in terms of that first step?
Yeah, and by the way, I think, Paul and Stuart have brought up an excellent point. And let me relate to you a story. So as an operator, as an advisor, as a board member, I've seen some great CEOs, and I've seen some ones that were just truly, your ugly cases that you wish upon no, company. And one of those ugly cases involved a CEO that I literally counted. There are 8 people who reported to the CEO. And in the course of about 4 years, that CEO had turned each of those positions over at least 3 times. So that should have been a clue, that like not all those people could have been idiots, right? And total underperformance. So why didn't the board really catch on to, hey, maybe there is an issue here? Yes, of course, organizations change, the skill sets that are required in any given position, whether it's VP of engineering or, chief financial officer, it may change as a company evolves. Yeah. But as a board, you really should have picked up on those signals. And maybe you should have done, some informal exit interviews yourself with people that you have come to know who recently left. Hey, I would benefit from, hear more about your experience and what, potential changes might happen. So I think the board can't just attend the board meeting and just listen to what the CEO or some of the senior management is telling you. If you start to kind of see those signs that culture is eroding, that, there are issues in turnover, maybe you haven't done an engagement survey, but maybe you could look a little deeper, go a level down, to maybe 2 levels down, have a great relationship with a CHRO so you can hear about those informal things, and maybe designate one person on the board who has perhaps the best relationship with a CEO, to kind of have those honest discussions, and also, of course, have internal board discussions about, hey, what is everybody seeing here? Mm-hmm. And do we need to take action?
Can I make one final point here? Question of when. If at any point in time as a board, you don't have 100% belief and conviction in the CEO and what that person's doing, 99% is not enough. 98% is not close enough. It has to be 100%. If you ever have anything but 100%, you need to have a conversation about whether it's time to change.
And when you think about that conversation, moving from the boardroom to taking action, is the conversation with the CEO? Is it with the CHRO? Is it with both? How do you think about navigating that conversation when you move from 100% to less than 100% confidence?
Yeah, I'm talking from experience, and experience is a euphemism for mistake.
I'm very experienced.
In one particular situation, we kept believing that 95 could get to 100, or we kept hoping, probably it was better than believing, that 95 could get to 100. And as a board, we should have spent more time in executive session talking about that one and only topic to either get ourselves to 100%, to figure out a pathway to 100%, or we should have taken action. So we let some doubt linger. And even although it was a small amount of doubt, that small amount of doubt grew and grew, and that company didn't have a good outcome. So as I look back, I made a commitment to myself that if I am ever in a position where I have anything but 100% belief, I'm going to start that conversation.
I just want to
at the board first.
Yeah, please.
I want to comment on Stuart's point because I think it's so vital, and it speaks to the board dynamic, right? And so you can talk about the risk, right, of changing versus the benefits of changing. And the board is likely to be divided on that.
Yeah.
Some members of the board are likely to be a fan of the CEO. Maybe the CEO brought them on as directors. Some members are going to be more objective just because of their perspective and their backgrounds. And so you can never assume that the board is unified in that view. And so if there is a question, the first thing you have to do is get a sense for what do other members of the board think. And ultimately, that's the role of the chair of the board. Is the chair of the board has no power, no voting authority other than calling a meeting. It really comes down to, all right, now it's my job to herd the cats and figure out where are we? Or if we're greatly divided, I've got a lot of work to do. If we're actually all kind of thinking the same thing, but it hasn't congealed yet, now I have to get the board together and reach consensus, because if we need to make a change, there's a lot of work ahead. But and we'll talk about the when, but if you're not ready as a board with consensus on the most important issue in your governance role, which is to determine who runs the company, then we got a problem.
Yeah. Well, and one of the common things we hear from our vantage point when we're brought in to replace the CEO from our board clients is we waited too long. There's very rarely a situation where they said we acted too soon. So tying these 2 points together, I'm curious, and maybe I'll ask Mika you this point or this question: is the kind of gap the amount of time the board's dedicating to the topic? So if you vector into that less than 100% area, is the resolution to spend the appropriate amount of time to actually discuss it? Because I imagine that you're tight on time, you're meeting quarterly, it just kind of gets pushed to the side. You don't give it enough airtime. Is that your experience?
Yeah, and I think it depends a little bit on the stage of the company as well. With venture-backed companies, the investors, are usually having a lot of different conversations between board meetings. I find out that, much larger companies, it's hard to herd the cat sometimes. But with venture-backed companies, sometimes it is, because we've all seen the pattern recognition and you tend to recognize the issue. It's easier to corral the group and have these sorts of phone calls to discuss about these topics. But it is still, I agree with you that oftentimes the regrets that we have had as a venture investor is we should have done the CEO change sooner. Rarely do we say, oh, we let a good one go and look what happened. Sometimes, a financing or looming financing round, catapults that discussion, as well, right? Because you're starting to think about having different sorts of investors. They're asking questions. They might even, like we have done, in a term sheet, say the CEO has to change. That you have to bring the new CEO we've done that. And those were the right decisions to do it because we recognize that there is a gap between where the company says it wants to go in the next 2-3 years versus what the current CEO brought to the table. So sometimes it is externally catapulted, to have these discussions. But never, ever, ever do a CEO change when you only have like 4 months left in your cash runway. That's not a great.
Unless you're anxious to put a bridge in.
Yeah.
So maybe if we pivot into the why around these CEO changes. So we talked a little bit about the tension between the leadership continuity and the need for change. So I'm curious, Paul, from your experience, distinguishing between just normal organizational challenges, growing pains, and the actual, kind of genuine deficiencies that you feel like require intervention. How do you think about that tension?
Well, you can listen, companies have problems. We get as operators, we don't get paid to like run things. We get paid to solve problems. We wake up every morning thinking, all right, it's just a question of what new problem is going to emerge today that I hadn't anticipated. So managing problems is no big deal. And there should be some facility with which a CEO can take on problems and get over them. So when you see more problems emerge that were not anticipated or that don't get handled with some acuity and some agility, at that point you say, we're struggling a little bit more than I think we should. Now that's a judgment call. If you then pair that with any kind of a phase change, scaling up dramatically, going from pre-commercial to commercial or anything else that introduces new burdens, then you have to look and say, okay, is my team not engaged? What's causing this? Do we just not have the right skills? And you can lack a skill. We can compensate for a skill. You can acquire a skill. But if you lack more than a couple for where the company is going, at that point you say, listen, theoretically, this person is a good person and we can invest in them and maybe they'll get there. But that may not be the best approach and the fastest way to get the company well positioned. So I look at it, the skills gap. Is it something that is, very acutely bridgeable? Or if it's meaningful, at some point you just have to admit the company's demands are moving in a direction that this individual's background and phenotype don't match. You are where you are.
Mm-hmm. And Mika, you talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. So when you think about some of the ones that didn't go well, how do you, as a board member or an investor, think about a seamless transition? What does that look like, and what can companies do to set that up correctly?
Yeah, and it'll be very interesting hearing, my fellow panelists' views on that too. I think, so first of all, typically people kind of think about, well, okay, here's a founder CEO who was a technical person or a surgeon in clinical person, and you come to terms, that, okay, we need to get a different type of CEO in. And the easiest thing or the most tempting thing to do is to say, okay, we'll just slot that person to be a CTO or a CMO. And sometimes that's right, depending on the personality and how you define those roles. But I've also seen ugly cases where the now, CTO, the former CEO, still wanted to just put, himself into making decisions that may be at odds, with the direction the new CEO wants to take. So you have to really take a hard look to see, one, is it the right thing to do it? What benefits do you get out of it? How do you define it? How do you ensure that there's understanding all around, including people in the organization, like who gets to call the shots on here, right? So that there's no confusion about it. A lot of times, it doesn't work out, as tempting as it may be. So then the question is, as a board, what's another, way to handle it? And if you don't have a ready-made candidate that immediately take over the new CEO position, you might have to designate an intern person. If you have a capable CFO or COO, second in command, who knows the business really well, that could be a bridge to make the transition a little easier for the new. But I'm really curious what Stuart's experiencing, for example, has been.
Well, I think you have to remember that if you make that decision, unless it's because the CEO has done something, let's just say bad, there's no urgency, right? So you have time to plan your next moves and to plan them thoroughly. And either we've done our job well as a board and we've been building some succession candidates into our organization and we want to start looking at them through a more critical lens about, are they ready now? Are they capable of being ready soon? Or we've been sourcing or identifying people out in the market that if anything ever happened, we would want to have that person come lead our company, right? So building a pipeline, it's a bit easier as an operator to do that external pipeline building than it is as a board member, but it can still be done. So I very much believe that once you've made the decision, you take your time and are deliberate about it. The next thing is to be very, very clear about what you're looking for. And I don't see this done well most times. And by that, I mean, obviously there's experience. Obviously there's capabilities. There's also personality and impact on culture and fit in the organization. And you have to think about all those 4 components. And when I'm doing this, I spend days actually writing a position description before I even pass it over to David or someone like David. And within that, for example, in experience, my recent CTO hire, I wanted somebody with both big company and early stage company experience and I explained the reasons why. And then I said that in a tie, this one is dominant over that one. And here's why. So that means that the recruiters know exactly what I'm looking for on every attribute and how I prioritize every attribute. And funnily enough, we ended up getting that. That was the first candidate I met in that process. We ended up hiring him and he's been phenomenal.
You'd be amazed at how oftentimes that level of diligence is not done. And it is unbelievably critical. An earlier panel today talked about force ranking. And I do think what you described, Stuart, is really important on the trade-offs, because there's always trade-offs. So getting a board to force rank, seeing where there's lack of alignment, because so much of a CEO search, when you do get to the replacement decision, is about managing the boardroom dynamics that you mentioned earlier, Paul, and figuring out what those trade-offs are and getting the alignment.
The other thing I would say, I love the force ranking. I think that's really important. It's important to do it ahead of time, because when you finally have your 2 candidates, you're already forming opinions about who likes whom. But if you made those rank orders earlier and set them in stone earlier, now we have a clearer set of decision criteria. I think on the continuity, I think continuity is overrated. I think we worry too much about the future and we're not optimistic enough about what new blood can bring to a company. I never worked for Medtronic, let the record show. But Bill George was a good friend and a mentor. And, when Bill George left after 10 years and he said, I'm done, I need to leave. Now, Bill was a phenomenal CEO. No one would have ever said he should leave. But he said, my run here, I just feel somebody else now should take it to the next level. And he didn't want to stay on the board. Clean break, let the new team come in. You guys figure it out. And so I think that was a great example of where, perceived continuity. He's now still a professor of leadership at Harvard Business School. Like, listen, let the new group come in. They'll think of things, they'll energize in ways that we as an existing team may not. And you never know what's ahead. So let that happen. And I'll just make a quick comment on the board of Edwards, and obviously Mike Musalem, legendary CEO, only CEO the company's ever had. 11 million times return to investors. And he says, I'm going to retire. I'm 70 plus years old. And we were really worried. How do you replace Mike Musalem? And the answer is you can't do it. And we had people in the company say, well, if Mike leaves, I'm going to leave. Well, why would you leave the company? It's about the company.
Yeah.
It's about your role, and it's about what we do for patients. And so got people over that notion that, this is not just about a single person. This is about advancing the cause. And oh, by the way, the next generation of leadership can do special things for the company in ways that Mike knew, and we had succession plan. But the point was, how do you kind of embrace the fact that, we're going to go through discontinuity from a legendary, no one would ever say they would want to work for anyone more than they would want to work for Mike Musalem. Yeah. Well, but you got to move on. And guess what? That doesn't mean the company can't absolutely thrive, although it won't always just feel exactly the same way.
Yes.
So I absolutely agree with your points there. There are 4 things that people need to be able to follow somebody or a team. Compassion, stability, hope, and trust. And stability is by far and away the least important one of the 4 attributes. So if you don't have trust and hope, then stability is important. But if you've got trust and hope and belief, so you keep changing.
Get through it.
Yeah, iterate. Just iterate.
We're going to pivot into successfully executing the transitions. We've already delved into that topic quite a bit. But I want to encourage those in the audience. We have a little bit under 10 minutes left to interrupt us at some point in the next 6 minutes and 54 seconds with your questions, because we do have a wealth of experience up in front of us from a panel today. Paul mentioned the successful transition away from Mike to Bernard. A lot of fear in kind of replacing a giant like Mike. Last time I checked, Edwards is still in business, doing well. So I imagine some of that fear was misplaced. But whether it's an at-scale CEO transition like that or an earlier high-stage growth venture, when you think about executing a successful transition, what would be those hallmarks of success for you?
Well, I would go back to Stuart with his a high level of preparation, identification of the key attributes, and then rank ordering what's most important, because there's no perfect profile. You will find surprisingly good candidates that may be of a different form, but you ultimately have to come back to what is it that we are really prioritizing, about a little bit about stability, but much more about taking us to a new level. And so you have to really think about what's the business strategy, what will we look like, not next year, but in the next, especially for a large public company, as compared to a Series B going to Series C. A large public company is thinking about a 5 and 10 year horizon. So where will we be then? And what do we like? It's easy to fall in love with your company. Mm-hmm. What do we love about our company? But what do we really want to change? And we need to bring in someone who's willing to be a change agent for that positive growth. And so you really just have to think it through, talk it through. No one's got the right answer. Drive a process, and importantly, succession. There is no time not to be in succession planning mode. Mm-hmm. It's got to be ongoing. Anyone can get hit by a bus. You never know. And you can never be too prepared.
Yeah, we do get that question quite a bit in terms of when do we start thinking about the CEO transition, and the right answer is the day after the CEO starts, mm-hmm. because it's never too early to start, particularly as it relates to internal versus external succession. So Mika, when you think about portfolio companies that you've been involved in, I believe there's a kind of bias that at those smaller scales that there's not enough room for internal succession, but I think that's probably not always the case. So when you think about internal versus external, mm-hmm. what would you challenge as far as the thinking of some of these higher growth stage ventures?
Yeah, and again, it kind of comes back down to what Stuart and Paul were saying, right? So just objectively from a clean blank, piece of paper, write down what is going to be, your hope for the company for the next few years. Where is the puck going and how do you need to skate to it? And then translate those to the qualities, the experiences, the skill sets, the personality, and the growth potential for these internal candidates, right? Because, okay, unless, the CEO wins a mega, lottery and decides to retire, you have to kind of think a few years ahead. So it is true that it is rarer for venture-backed companies to have a strong internal candidate. Seen it, where a COO was able to step into the CEO. We thought initially that it may be a temporary arrangement, but it turned out that actually, the person performed wonderfully, used the board very effectively, and was able to make that transition. But that is a little bit rarer for that. But that doesn't mean that you need to have a good succession plan, even for a smaller organization. And it's not just the CEO position, but it's the next level down. Do you, again, for each position, where do you want that position to evolve? And do you have the right mix? Can you potentially still have the right mix 3 years, from now in those positions? So it has to be a continuous process.
I would encourage early stage companies to seriously consider a high-level operator. And I don't mean an operating partner necessarily. I mean an operator on your board, because it does buy you a level of fallback comfort and an option if you have an unforeseen CEO transition.
We refer to that as the installed spare.
So there's a word for it.
I don't know if that's the right word.
Okay, I need to remember that.
Yes, sir. So we have less than 2 minutes left. So maybe we'll start with Paul, followed by Mika, and Stuart, you will back cleanup. Just a few, kind of parting comments on this topic.
Well, everything revolves around the CEO. So you can't ever take this lightly. You don't want to just go into change and not respect all of the ramifications. But CEOs come and go. So embrace the fact that if there is a need for a change, voluntary, involuntary, whatever the circumstances, recognize that, and this is true, we've all said this, there's always an opportunity to upgrade. There's always an opportunity to put someone in who's, even if not better for today, better for the future. So I just look at it and say, don't fear it. It's a big change. Don't underestimate it, but never hesitate to embrace that need to change. You can improve the company every time.
I echo that. And one of the things that I always thought, okay, so you want the CEO in early stage company to be a visionary, right? But visionary doesn't equate to being a cult leader. And so again, to Paul's point, you always can bring in a different type of visionary leader that may be visionary about a different stage of the company, from the founding CEO. And the boards really need to spend the time thinking about it. Where I think we have a problem as a board for venture-backed companies is if you have a board member who sits on 12 different boards and has become a clipboard board member, and is not engaged enough, to Stuart, your point, is not an operator, doesn't understand those things, that's where you can get into trouble, as a board. So get somebody with operational background on your board.
And Stuart, over to you to
the CEO is everything, but the CEO is not everything, is the key message. And don't be afraid to have the conversation. Don't be afraid to make the decision. And don't be afraid to reach higher. Because invariably you're having the conversation and making a decision because you're not satisfied. There is a better future, a better tomorrow. You just have to have confidence about acting on it.
I wrote down the 4 things you said: compassion, stability, hope, and trust. Did I get those right? With stability being the least important. So the thing I learned from you, the 3 of you today, was just the tension between continuity and change is definitely hyped in our minds. And whether you're replacing a giant like Mike Musalem or even Bill George, the companies will persist. So thank you.
Great.
Nice, Stuart. Great job.